Hi, welcome back to Ilanomics. It's been exactly 2 months since we did the last episode of Ilanomics, where Professor Ila Patnaik and me, YP Rajesh, managing editor at ThePrint, went live, taking your questions, discussing important economic issues of the day. And we had to take a break because partly due to a personal issue, and I got infected and turned positive and recovered and all of that. So it's good to be back, good to be among all of you. Hi, Ila, welcome back. We missed this conversation.
Hi, YP. Welcome back. It's so nice to have you back, and I hope you've recovered fully.
Yeah, thanks, Ila. Thank you. A lot of things have happened. It's been, the second wave, the peak of the second wave in April and May, and fortunately, the peak is past us, and we are the graph and the curve is being bent a second time, and that was a very nasty, ferocious wave. But the impact of the wave is still with us, will be with us, especially economically, and Ela has been discussing it over the last 2 months in her columns, in her videos. And what Ela has written today, and that is on the print.in. You will get the link for that in the description of this video, is about how this second wave and the difficulties brought by the second wave are forcing a lot of families in India to borrow because livelihoods have been affected once again, and people are finding it difficult to make ends meet. Household borrowing has gone up, and this is not just something that is anecdotal. It is there in the RBI data. So Ila, I know you talked about the first wave, but what is happening in the second wave uh, is not too different, is it?
Well, the second wave is not as deep. So the contraction in GDP that we saw in the first wave is not happening in the second wave. But as we try all the time to try to understand what's happening and try to look at the data and figure out how are people coping, how are households coping, what are their lives. I mean, so this was really part of that same effort to try to see what is the data that we can see for understanding how people are coping. So, the way we look at employment data, demand data, this time we looked at RBI data, the latest release of the data, which is telling us how personal loans have increased. And not only have personal loans increased, the most striking fact about what we are seeing in this data is that compared to last year, and last year this time was not good. Okay, so remember last year, so it's the first half of the year for which data is available, but we are seeing an increase in borrowing against gold, an 86% increase this April compared to last April. Uh, so that tells you a little about the kind of mechanisms that people are using to cope, because very often we are asked, why is it that the West is giving these income support measures? We are not giving these income support measures. How are we coping? Is it just the PDS, or what are the internal resources that households have based on which they're finding mechanisms to cope? So this was part of that. And in this, we also looked at whether households are buying consumer durables. So last year, yes, uh, there was demand for consumer durables in terms of getting personal loans, getting loans for durables. But this time we are seeing that that demand has gone down. So it tells you what is happening to household balance sheets at a time like this, because incomes have gone down. And how do you borrow, what do you borrow against, what do you borrow for? So putting this data together, it seems that households are borrowing against gold to try to meet their regular non-durable consumption needs.
Ela, if we can get into a little bit of the nuances of the data, since you have analyzed the data, what does the data tell you in terms of some kind of distribution? Is it happening more in the cities or in the B centers? Is it happening among middle classes or the lower middle classes? Do we have any kind of those finer nuances available?
So, when you look at credit data from RBI, it does not tell you who is borrowing. But other data, so for example, data from internet, borrowing from internet, where
Hmm.
people reach out to young people, and there you are seeing a large increase in the borrowers being below 30 years of age. So but still, YP, all this is formal credit markets.
Hmm.
This
Hmm.
is where we get to see it. Whereas a lot of what is happening is, anecdotally, what we hear is through informal credit markets, where people borrow, they borrow from relatives, from friends, and that is one of the large sources of borrowing.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that data we're not actually seeing. But I think the formal market does give us some sense of what is happening in the informal markets as well.
Mhm. And then there are, other informal sources like money lenders. And people who work for you may borrow money from you. One is the borrowing part, Ila. The other thing is, how many of them are able to repay it? Especially at least in the formal sector, are we seeing any defaults there?
See, that hasn't come yet
Mhm.
because the borrowing increases are coming now. The large increases in borrowing are coming in the last couple of months or so. And that has increased household debt. Now, household debt data is a little dated. So that has also shown an increase. But when we get that, we'll see. I mean, it is pretty logical to, it's just common sense that
Mhm.
incomes have gone down. Many people have lost their jobs. Shops are shut, so they're not able to earn their living
Yeah.
by selling whatever they were selling in the shops. So those people do need some ways to survive, and
Mhm.
so they're borrowing. And I think that the only way that they can come back to returning those loans would be when they can get their incomes back.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there is a limit to which you can stretch your balance sheet and borrow. You can borrow against your house, you can borrow against gold, and gold is the most liquid asset against which borrowing is easily available.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we'll see how soon we can get their incomes back on track, and that's what
Mhm.
will get their balance sheets back on track.
In fact, last year, Ila, when the first wave was around, I remember reading and watching on television where analysts were saying, the two gold loan companies, Muthoot and Manappuram Finance, those are the two stocks to invest in because their business is really, really soaring because a lot of people were pledging their gold last year and borrowing money from them.
Yeah. So,
So
yes.
the other point, Ela, you make in your column is about the MSME sector, the
Yes.
micro, small, and medium enterprises
Mhm.
sector. And so it's not just about individuals who are affected; it's also this MSME sector which is affected. Although the government made some allowance in last year for MSMEs to dip into.
Yeah, so actually, if you look at where most of bank credit goes, bank credit to industry or bank credit to the commercial sector, it's as the series is often called, or non-food credit. So we usually subtract out what goes to the Corporation of India, and we look at this series of non-food credit. Now that growth has been sluggish, so that's been around 6.5 or so. What's been happening is that big industry hasn't been borrowing much. So the big borrowers who really account for 90 to 95% of borrowing, they're not the ones who are borrowing. Their credit growth is very slow. It is the MSMEs which one doubts that this is because of really demand side effects, because their demand for credit has increased because of conditions outside, or whether it is because they have to borrow to repay the loans, borrow to pay salaries. So it's more of a difficult sort of borrowing rather than borrowing to increase capacity. Their borrowing has increased, and fortunately, because they've got banks have got various incentives, that 3 lakh crore and Atmanirbhar Bharat and so on. They've got incentives to lend to MSMEs. So the credit growth that we see is really increase in growth for MSMEs rather than for big companies.
Mhm. Ela, I have a lot of questions of my own, but before I, continue with that, we have a lot of our viewers asking questions. I have my laptop on my left-hand side, so I'm just looking at those questions there. So please don't think I'm being rude and not looking at the screen or the camera. And before I take questions, I have that one appeal I make every week, and I have not made that for 2 months. So you must, listen to me about the fact that why we need subscribers to contribute. And I said contribute, take subscriptions, pay and take subscriptions. This economy, this second wave is only hurting media companies much more than it did in the first wave, and we need your support. So please do take subscriptions. Go to the print.in/subscribe. It will be there just below this video. Take your subscriptions because we need you to support good journalism. We've ensured that you've had Ilanomics through the second wave. Our reporters have traveled around, brought you the best of the ground reports from around the country. So why should you read them free? Take a subscription, and you will be doing a great deed for good journalism. So my first question will be from Minhaj Ahmad Ansari. Minhaj, hi, thank you so much, Minhaj. Why do we need to stop borrowing? Is this question, because I think our headline for the video says how to stop it. Why do we need to stop it? In fact, in the second wave, almost all industries are working at their full capacity. If anything, consumers don't have the freedom to purchase due to scattered lockdowns.
No, no, I don't think we meant that you should not borrow. I just think that the person who wrote the headline must have understood it as how do we need to not increase household indebtedness and allow incomes to come back, them to go back to earning.
Mhm.
And that was the spirit in which I guess that headline was written.
I am
So,
guilty, Ila. That was me.
okay, you. So I guess that's what you're thinking might be. Yeah, right?
Yeah. How
Yeah.
to stop people from just borrowing more instead of going and spending and earning more and being able to spur demand.
Yeah, and we only have one answer, which is that people need to get vaccinated and
Mhm.
that the government needs to provide vaccines, arrange for vaccination, just get the pace up, get people vaccinated as efficiently, as fast as we can, so that they can go back and we don't get more lockdowns and we can just go back to work. And I think that's the spirit in which that question was asked.
Absolutely. Samir Chaudhary, hi Samir. Is increased borrowing a sign of low savings in Indian families, or is it due to the sudden opening of the economy? I didn't get the
So,
second part.
no, so if you look at balance sheets of Indian households, uh, in India compared to anywhere else in the world, there might be a few countries which are like us, but compared to most countries in the world, in India, households have more gold, so the share of gold is higher. And actually, the purpose of holding gold is for emergency. It's a
Mhm,
liquid asset. I mean, of course, it's become part of the culture, it's become part of weddings, it's become part of women's wealth, stridhan,
inheritance.
inheritance, and so on. But essentially, the main purpose of holding gold compared to, say, a house is because gold is a very liquid asset. So you can take, a small part of your total holding of gold and borrow against it. And in times of emergency or distress, it allows you to borrow. So that's what households appear to be doing. So, I
Mhm,
mean, I'm only looking at the outcome, which is an
mhm,
86% increase in household borrowing against loan. That's the
mhm,
outcome. So, from
mhm,
that, what we can deduce is that yes, this was something that they had kept for such purposes. And now, because households have heavily depended on or bought gold for on they hold gold in their balance
mhm,
sheets, they are using that asset
mhm.
and borrowing against it.
Karun Menon is our next questioner. Hello, Karun. Even at the highest number of cases during the second wave of COVID, the Indian share market stood unaffected from this. What is the reason behind this irregularity? Is it because of the crony nature of our market?
So, YP, I always get these questions about the share market, and I think you worked on share markets much more than I have. So, why don't I toss that question back to you?
Oh my. No, it's not. I've not worked on share markets, but yes, I track them a little bit. So my point, Karun, is that there is a lot of liquidity in the system, not only in the domestic system. There is liquidity coming from outside of India. We call it hot money. The technical analysts call it foreign portfolio investments. The interest rates are low outside of India, so people are coming to India, to the Indian stock markets, because they think the valuations are good, and the Indian stock market is not talking about earnings and performance of the economy in 2021. They're looking at 22 and 23. That's how the stock market works. Some people call it a gamble, and we have even said that in these conditions it sounds a little bit like that. But the stock markets are always looking at 1 and 2 years ahead, and money goes wherever it thinks interest or earnings are higher. Just wait for if the US Fed increases interest rates there, all the money will flow back to the US, and you will see our markets going down. So it's a very different kind of an animal, the stock market, if I can call it that.
I
Did I
may
make sense, Leela?
Yeah, yeah. I think, excuse me for my voice, my throat. Uh, if I may just add to that, I think that, from where we are standing today, the economy is done this time, in the second wave, better than it did in the first wave. And if we are, making an effort to vaccinate, and we can do that slowly, we may actually avoid a third wave.
Yeah.
So if we get vaccinated, if we have, we also follow COVID appropriate norms, then, and if we avoid a third wave,
Mhm,
then the economy will actually be looking up quite a bit.
mhm.
And among emerging economies, India has been a strong economy. So that's something that would attract people. You're not actually looking at a economy that is looking down, but
Yeah.
things have started looking up. So that would be part of the reason.
Sankalp has a question. Hello, Sankalp. In retrospect, do you think that the total lockdown last year was an overkill? After all, the curfew measures have at least arrested the economic fallout.
So last year, I think the big problem was that now we can talk about it with the benefit of hindsight. We did not have testing facilities. We did not know how much COVID has spread. So even when we were, let's say for the first few days, we were continuing to have our this very program. We were continuing to do it physically, and I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
traveling to the
yeah,
print. It was in a bit of a fog where one
yeah,
did not understand whether somebody next to me had COVID or not,
yeah,
because testing facilities had still to develop. Now, when one looks back, one can always say, no, we should have had testing facilities. We should have known that people don't have COVID, and we should have not, had such a nationwide lockdown.
yeah,
But I think that it's very easy to say these things with the benefit of hindsight.
yeah, yeah,
And so,
yeah.
if with the benefit of hindsight, we want to say that because today we have information, then that seems a bit of an overkill, of course, because so many people, there weren't so many cases.
Mhm.
But the thing with such decisions are that they get taken at a time when you don't know what's going on. We also, I think, what really scared India at that time was the Italian, uh, the way it was spreading in Italy,
Italy.
and
Yeah,
the way
yeah,
there were deaths. I mean, where almost a bit like what we have had later, but we haven't had so many deaths. But the spread was like that. There was no cure, people were dying, and it looked like the Indian medical system is far worse than the Italian medical system.
yeah,
So it looked like, look, if they with their and health system can't cope, if this comes to us, how will we cope? And we don't know whether it's come or not.
Yeah.
So yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, it does, and the knowledge we have today, it does look like overkill. But I
Yeah.
think policy making or decision making under uncertainty often looks like that.
I will tell you one more quick anecdote about overkill. Just yesterday or day before, I was listening to a podcast from one of the Western Science podcasts, and it was an interview where they said washing hands or getting infected through your hands must be the least of your worries right now. It's actually the aerosols in the air you breathe because the virus is in the air. But just imagine, how we washed our hands like crazy last year, and we still do. I mean, hand sanitizers and soap companies made so much money and continue to do so. So, I mean, we are learning with this virus and this pandemic almost every day, every week, every month.
Yeah.
Gaurav Harlaka, hello, Gaurav. What do you think will be the impact on the economy when loans will be classified as NPAs and when RBI provisions expire, which is what I was talking about,
Yeah.
defaults?
Yeah. So, one story that's being told is that after the pandemic, the banking sector is going to be in a very, very, very big crisis, and that's something that I was also concerned about. But look at the data. What you're seeing is more of credit to small companies. That it's the small companies who are borrowing, and the big companies have actually cut costs. If you look at the share of credit to small companies, it is between 5 to 6%. So medium and small MSMEs get about 5 to 6% of total bank credit. Now, yes, they seem to be the ones who will turn more NPAs than anybody else. Then, of course, there's a special sector which is the hotel and the aviation, and where we expect that they'll get some government support. But certainly, in terms of other than that, the other sectors, it's more of MSMEs which have a very small portion of credit. So the situation at the end of the day might not be that bad. When you look at profits of large companies, they've actually managed to do cost cutting and save, and their profits have improved, and their borrowing has declined. So let's just wait this out. And my sense is that things are not going to be as bad
Mhm.
for the banking sector NPS. I mean, they're not going to be as bad
Mhm.
as we had anticipated a few months ago.
I know, Ila, you have a meeting to rush to, so there are two, three more questions, but I will try and combine as many of them as possible so you can probably give one or two last answers. Ankit, Nakshane, Sankalp, Anurag Singh, Tanmay Suri all have questions. Ankit says, do you think increasing global inflation and fuel prices will hurt economic growth after the pandemic? Considering revenge spending. So I don't know why he is expecting revenge spending. Sankalp is talking about printing money. Why is it printing money not an answer? We keep talking about printing money very often on this show. Can't the government borrow from foreign deposits and increase spending? Uh, and Tanmay says, is it safe to say that if families are borrowing more, then this is a good indication of consumption increasing? If yes, then isn't that what the economy needs now? We answered that question earlier.
Yeah, it's consumption, but not so much for consumer durables, but
Yeah.
for regular
Basic
consumption,
needs.
basic needs, essential non-durables consumption.
Mhm.
No, I think the inflation will and could become a concern, but not so much right now because we domestically don't have a demand pressure, and we're not seeing demand pressures.
Mhm.
It could become a concern in terms of imported inflation because economies like the US, I mean, there's a raging debate going on there where there are many people who believe that because of the increase, both fiscal stimulus and a monetary stimulus, the US economy may actually start facing inflation. And if you have global inflation and you have commodity prices rising, then that would increase our imported inflation. Uh, as regards to printing money, we talked about it when in your absence, YP, that yes, we could print some money, but let's be very clear: printing money leads to inflation. That's why it's Senior Raj is called an inflation tax.
Mhm.
So yes, we could think about how much we want to do. So let's be clear: one, how much inflation tax do you want, and what are the kind of resources that will the money be well spent, and what you're going to do with it. Second, how are you going to get out of it? So deficit. It used to be called deficit financing in the 80s, and this was an institutional mechanism through which the central government could borrow from the Reserve Bank of India, and then the Reserve Bank of India could just print money and give to the central government. uh, in the 80s, it led to high inflation, and part of the crisis that we saw, which was the 91 balance of payment crisis, was did originate from this. Subsequent to that, and understanding this problem, the Ways and Means Agreement was signed between the Reserve Bank of India and the central government, precisely to prevent that sort of a situation from arising again. So, for those people who are suggesting that there should be, deficit financing again, they should also be coming up with a very clear exit plan, so that it's not something that we get trapped in, and that even when things get back to normal, governments, as governments always do, like to borrow and spend money. So we, as an institutional arrangement, the hands of the central government were tied down. The central government was prevented from deficit financing. And in the 97 Ways and Means Agreement, it was very clear that central government, the RBI would hold central government bills of up to 6 months, and it would not become deficit financing as it did earlier. So fine, we could get into it, but before we get into it, we must know how to get out of it.
Mhm.
It uh, shouldn't be something that one can never end and one gets trapped in. So
Uh,
that's yeah.
no, no, not an addiction is what you mean.
Huh.
Okay, Ila, I'll let you go with just one last question from me. The V-shaped recovery obviously didn't happen. What is the shape in your head? Is it K?
Well, I think the first sort of after the first lockdown, if you look at the graphs of production or some of the other indicators, then they are pretty V. Okay.
Mhm,
But now we are not getting that deep V. So now we're getting a sort of longish U. And I think we'll recover out of this pretty fast, actually. I think
mhm,
things, the second wave is in, the numbers have come down,
mhm,
vaccine numbers are improving, employment numbers are looking good, and many people have said that they will be hiring more. So yes, there will be some, of course, that there is distress. Households
mhm.
have with great difficulty coped. Many of them have lost their family members and very, very close friends. But in terms of the economy, I think that we'll be able to recover pretty fast.
That is good to hear and end on that note. Ila, thank you so much. Thank you to all our viewers. We will be back again next Friday with a new episode. Please do tune in, read the print.in, and look forward to being here next Friday.